2 empires fell in a single generation. Their palaces burned and their names erased from memory. 1,000 miles away, builders dragged 20-ton stones into place, then buried their own temple under the earth on purpose. These are 10 civilizations that vanished, and the science behind why. All right, let's go. Number 10. The Sea Peoples, the raiders who broke the Bronze Age. Around 1177 BC, a wave of attackers swept across the eastern Mediterranean. Within roughly 50 years, the great powers of the age collapsed almost simultaneously. The Hittite Empire, which had rivaled Egypt for centuries, simply ceased to exist. The wealthy trading city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast burned and was never rebuilt. Mycenaean Greece, the world of the heroes Homer would later sing about, fell into a dark age so complete that the Greeks forgot how to write for 300 years.
We know about the attackers mainly from one source, the mortuary temple of Pharaoh Ramesses III at Medinet Habu in Egypt.
Carved into its walls are detailed reliefs of a great land and sea battle, dated to around 1175 BC. The Egyptian inscriptions name the invaders and describe how they came. One passage reads that no land could stand before them, that they swept across Hatti, Carchemish, and Cyprus, and that they set up camp in a place called Amuru while their fleet advanced. Ramses claims he defeated them at the mouths of the Nile, and the archaeology suggests Egypt did survive, though weakened. The strange part is who they actually were. The Egyptian texts list groups with names like the Peliset, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and the Shurdin. Scholars have spent over a century arguing about where these names point. Some connect the Peliset to the later Philistines who settled in Canaan, and there is real archaeological support for that link, including pottery styles imported from the Aegean. But the broader picture stays blurry. Were these organized armies, displaced refugees, or migrating populations moving with their families and ox carts? The reliefs show women and children riding in wagons, which argues against a simple raiding fleet. For decades, the standard story blamed everything on these invaders. A single barbarian horde, sweeping in and toppling civilizations like dominoes. That explanation has fallen apart under closer study. The collapse was too widespread and too synchronized to have one cause. Researchers now point to a system that was already failing from within. Climate evidence tells part of the story. Pollen cores taken from the Sea of Galilee and from a lagoon in Cyprus show a sharp, prolonged drought beginning around 1250 BC and lasting roughly 150 years. Crops failed across the region. There are actual letters, baked into clay and preserved when cities burned, that record the desperation. A Hittite king writes to Ugarit begging for grain, calling it a matter of life and death. Famine spread, trade routes that carried tin and copper broke down, and bronze itself, the metal that named the age, became harder to make. So the Sea Peoples may have been less the cause of the collapse than its consequence. Picture societies cracking under drought, famine, and earthquake swarms that geologists have traced across the same decades. Populations on the move, some fighting, some fleeing, some doing both. The raiders who hit Egypt's shores were probably part of a much larger churning of desperate people across an entire failing world. After the dust settled, the Sea Peoples vanished as a distinct force. Some groups settled and were absorbed. Most simply disappear from the record, leaving only the carved boasts of an Egyptian pharaoh and a scattering of foreign pottery. They remain the oldest cold case in history, a reminder that the most advanced world of its time could come apart in a single lifetime, and that the people who got the blame may have been victims running from the same fire. Number 9. The CUCUTENI-TRYPILLIA culture, the people who burned their own cities. Long before the pyramids, between roughly 5,500 and 2750 BC, The largest settlements on Earth stood not in Mesopotamia, but on the plains of what is now Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania. Archaeologists studying sites like Talyanki and Maidanetska, excavated heavily from the 1970s onward, found something that did not fit the textbook timeline of human history. These were cities, and they predated the supposed first cities of the Near East by centuries. The scale is hard to absorb. Talyanki covered around 320 hectares and may have held up to 15,000 people. Geophysical surveys, which let researchers map buried structures without digging, revealed thousands of houses laid out in vast concentric rings, with streets and open public spaces in the center. These were planned communities, built by farmers who grew wheat and barley, raised cattle, and produced some of the most beautiful painted pottery of the ancient world, decorated with spirals and flowing geometric patterns. Then comes the part nobody fully understands. Every 60 to 80 years, the inhabitants set their entire city on fire. Excavations show that the burning was deliberate and thorough. The clay and timber houses were packed with enough flammable material to reach temperatures that vitrified the mud brick, turning it almost to ceramic. After the fire, the people rebuilt, sometimes directly on top of the ashes, sometimes nearby, and the cycle began again across 1,000 years. Why would anyone destroy a thriving settlement on a schedule? The theories split. Some archaeologists argue it was practical. Wooden buildings rot and attract pests, and a controlled burn followed by rebuilding gave each generation fresh, clean housing. Others read it as ritual, a way of marking time, renewing the community, perhaps closing one cycle of life so another could begin. The houses sometimes contained smashed pottery and figurines placed before the burning, which hints at ceremony rather than pure maintenance. We may be looking at one of the earliest examples of a society where belief and architecture were inseparable. What makes this culture so important is how it scrambles our assumptions about early civilization. The standard model says cities arise from kings, central authority, social hierarchy, and often warfare. CUCUTENI-TRYPILLIA shows almost none of that. There are no palaces, no obvious rich versus poor divide in the housing, no monumental temples towering over everyone else, and remarkably little evidence of organized violence. People built enormous, ordered settlements and seem to have governed themselves without the strongmen we assume are required. It suggests humans found more than one path to living together at scale. The ending is as quiet as the cities were large. After 2750 BC, the megasites were abandoned and never rebuilt. The reasons probably stack together. The same climate shift toward cooler, drier conditions that troubled other regions strained their farming. Soil exhaustion from centuries of cultivation may have caught up with them, and new peoples were moving in from the eastern steppe, herders with horses and a different way of life, whose arrival reshaped the genetics and culture of all of Europe. The painted pots stopped being made. The great rings of houses dissolved back into the plains until only burned clay and patient survey equipment could find them again. A people who built the biggest cities on the planet, who chose fire as part of how they lived, left no writing to explain themselves. We are left staring at the ashes of a world that worked by rules we are still trying to read. Number 8. The CLOVIS culture. The first Americans who vanished in an instant. For most of the 20th century, the textbook answer for who first peopled the Americas was simple: the Clovis people. Named after a town in New Mexico where their distinctive tools were first identified in the 1930s, they appear in the archaeological record around 13,000 years ago and spread across North America with startling speed. Their signature is a weapon. The Clovis point is a beautifully made stone spearhead, finely worked on both faces, with a distinctive groove called a flute running up from the base. This flute let the point be lashed securely onto a wooden shaft. These tools have been found from the deserts of the Southwest to the swamps of Florida, often alongside the bones of the giant animals these hunters pursued: mammoths, mastodons, and ancient bison.
At sites like Blackwater Draw, archaeologists found Clovis points lodged among mammoth remains.
Frozen evidence of a hunt that ended around 13,000 years ago. Then, within a window of perhaps a few centuries, the Clovis toolkit disappears from the record. The fluted points stop being made, and the great animals they hunted vanish too. The North American megafauna, the mammoths, the giant ground sloths, the camels and horses that once roamed the continent, went extinct in the same blink of geological time. Something happened around 12,800 years ago that hit both the hunters and the hunted. The timing lines up with a dramatic climate event. Just as the planet was warming out of the last ice age, the northern hemisphere suddenly snapped back into near glacial cold. This period is called the Younger Dryas, and it lasted around 1,200 years. The cause is debated. The leading explanation involves a massive pulse of cold fresh water into the North Atlantic, possibly from a melting ice sheet, which disrupted ocean currents and chilled the climate. But there is a bolder and more controversial idea. Some researchers argue that a comet, or fragments of one, exploded over or struck North America at exactly this moment. They point to a thin layer in the soil, found at sites across several continents, that contains tiny spherules, microscopic diamonds, and elevated platinum, all of which can be linked to an impact event. In this scenario, airbursts and fires devastated the landscape, helped drive the megafauna extinct, and shattered the Clovis way of life. The impact hypothesis remains hotly disputed. Many scientists argue the evidence can be explained by ordinary processes, and that no crater of the right age has been confirmed. The more accepted view spreads the blame across the rapid climate swing of the Younger Dryas and the pressure of human hunting on already stressed animal populations. There is also a deeper twist. The Clovis people were never truly the first. Sites that predate them, like Monte Verde in Chile, prove that humans were in the Americas well before the Clovis points appear. So Clovis was not the beginning of the story, but a brilliant, fast-spreading chapter that ended abruptly. The people themselves did not all die out. Their descendants adapted, changed their tools, and became the diverse Native American cultures that followed. What vanished was a specific way of life, a partnership between elite hunters and the giant beasts of the Ice Age, ended by a changing world. Number 7. Norte Chico, the peaceful builders of the America's oldest civilization. On the dry Pacific coast of Peru, in valleys cut by rivers running down from the Andes, lie the ruins of something that should not, by the usual rules, exist. The Norte Chico civilization, centered on the great site of Corral, flourished from around 3500 to 1800 BC. That makes it as old as the pyramids of Egypt and the cities of Mesopotamia, yet it grew up in total isolation from them, on the other side of the planet. Corral itself, excavated extensively from the 1990s by archaeologist Ruth Shady, is stunning. It contains 6 large platform mounds, the biggest standing around 18 meters tall and stretching 150 meters along its base. There are sunken circular plazas, residential areas, and signs of a complex society that organized thousands of people to build on a monumental scale. They dated the site using radiocarbon analysis of woven reed bags, called shikra, that the builders filled with stones and used as construction fill. The dates pushed the civilization back to nearly 3000 BC and stunned the field. Now the strange parts. Norte Chico had no pottery. None. A society building 18-meter pyramids and feeding a large population somehow did it without ceramic vessels, storing and cooking food by other means. They also seem to have had no real writing, though they may have used the knotted cords known as quipu, examples of which have been found at the site, possibly for record-keeping thousands of years before the Inca used the same system. And then, the detail that sets Norte Chico apart from nearly every other early civilization. There are almost no signs of war. Archaeologists have found no fortifications, no weapons designed for battle, no walls built for defense, and no mass graves or mutilated bodies of the kind that mark violent societies. The standard idea that civilization is forged through conquest and warfare does not fit here. Instead, what held Norte Chico together may have been trade and shared religion. They lived by farming cotton and other crops in the river valleys, and they traded that cotton with coastal fishing communities who used it to make nets. Cotton for fish, mountains feeding the sea. Music seems to have mattered to them too. Excavators found dozens of flutes made from condor and pelican bones. So how did such a society fade? After more than 1,000 years, the great centers were gradually abandoned around 1800 BC. There is no sign of invasion or massacre to explain it. The likeliest culprit is environmental. The Peruvian coast is brutally vulnerable to the climate pattern we call El Niño, which can bring devastating floods and then drought, wrecking the delicate balance of farming and fishing the whole system depended on. Shifts in this pattern may have undermined the food supply and the trade networks, and people drifted away to new centers elsewhere. Norte Chico did not so much die as dissolve. Its ideas passed down to the cultures that came after it in the Andes. It stands as proof that one of humanity's first great civilizations was built not on armies and kings demanding tribute, but on cotton, fish, music, and faith, raising mountains of stone in silence and leaving the rest of us to wonder how peace alone could build so much. Number 6. The Indus Valley Civilization, the masters of the city who left no kings. Around 2600 BC, while Egypt was building pyramids and Mesopotamia was raising ziggurats, an enormous civilization spread across the floodplains of the Indus River, covering much of modern Pakistan and northwest India. At its height, it stretched over an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, home to perhaps 5 million people. Yet, for thousands of years, almost no one knew it had ever existed. It was rediscovered only in the 1920s when excavations at two great sites, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, revealed cities that rewrote the map of the ancient world. What those excavations uncovered is astonishing for its time. These were not chaotic clusters of huts, but carefully planned cities, laid out on a grid with streets crossing at right angles. The houses were built of standardized fired bricks, made to consistent proportions across hundreds of miles, which tells us something about the coordination behind it all. Most striking of all was the plumbing. Many homes had private bathrooms and toilets connected to covered drains running beneath the streets, with manholes for access. There were public wells, bathing platforms, and at Mohenjo-Daro, a huge watertight basin known as the Great Bath. This was urban sanitation on a level the world would not see again for thousands of years. The society behind this seems to have valued order and uniformity. They had a standardized system of weights and measures used across the entire region, which points to organized trade. They traded with Mesopotamia by sea, and Indus seals have been found in Mesopotamian cities. They made fine jewelry, worked metals, and crafted small carved seals decorated with animals and figures. But here lies the great frustration. On those seals is a script, hundreds of short inscriptions, and after a century of effort, no one has been able to read it. We do not know what language they spoke, what they called themselves, or what their inscriptions say. The texts are very short. There is no known bilingual key like the Rosetta Stone, and so the Indus people remain silent. We can see their cities in extraordinary detail, and yet cannot hear a single word from them. there is another mystery layered on top. For all their wealth and organization, we have found no clear evidence of kings, no grand palaces, no enormous royal tombs stuffed with treasure, and surprisingly little sign of an army or warfare. Compared to Egypt and Mesopotamia, where rulers loom over everything, the Indus civilization seems strangely faceless. Who governed these vast, orderly cities? We genuinely do not know. And then, beginning around 1900 BC, this great civilization unwound. The cities were gradually abandoned. The sophisticated drainage fell into disrepair. The standardized weights stopped being used, and the population dispersed into smaller villages. For a long time, people imagined a dramatic invasion, but the evidence for that has largely collapsed. There is no layer of destruction, no sign of a great battle that ended it all. The likeliest explanation, once again, is the slow violence of a changing environment. Climate studies suggest the monsoon weakened over this period, reducing the rains the farming relied on. Even more important, the rivers themselves shifted. The Indus is fed by complex river systems, and evidence suggests one major river, possibly drying or changing course, pulled the rug out from under the cities that depended on it. As water and agriculture faltered, the great urban experiment became impossible to sustain, and people moved east toward the Ganges plains, carrying their knowledge with them. The Indus civilization did not so much fall as fade, leaving behind perfect drains, unreadable words, and the haunting question of who these people truly were. Number 5. Cahokia, the lost metropolis north of Mexico. Just across the Mississippi River from modern St. Louis stand a series of grassy mounds that most passing drivers never notice. They are all that remains visible of Cahokia, the largest and most sophisticated city ever built in North America before the arrival of Europeans. At its peak, around 1100 AD, Cahokia may have held as many as 20,000 people, making it larger than London was at the same moment in history. The heart of the city was a feat of engineering. Monk's Mound, the largest earthwork in the Americas, rises in terraces to about 30 meters and covers a base larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was built entirely by hand, basket of earth by basket of earth, an estimated 22 million cubic feet of soil carried and shaped by human labor. Around it spread plazas, neighborhoods, and over 100 more mounds. The people who built it are known as the Mississippian culture, and they were skilled farmers whose civilization was powered by one crop above all: maize. Cahokia was a true urban center with what looks like real social complexity. There is evidence of a powerful elite. At a feature called Mound 72, archaeologists uncovered a high-status burial, a man laid out on a bed of more than 20,000 shell beads, surrounded by other burials, including groups of young women who appear to have been sacrificed. This points to a society with rulers, ritual, and the kind of stratification we associate with major civilizations. They built astronomical alignments too, including a great circle of timber posts nicknamed Woodhenge, used to track the sun through the seasons. The city also reveals one of the perils of its own success. To build and fuel a metropolis, the Cahokians cut down enormous quantities of timber from the surrounding hills. Some researchers argue this deforestation may have caused erosion and worsened flooding along the local creeks, damaging the very farmland the city depended on. A growing population, a fragile food supply, and an environment under strain make a dangerous combination. By around 1350 to 1400 AD, Cahokia was empty. The great city that had thrived for centuries was deliberately and completely abandoned. The mounds left to the grass. No European ever saw it alive. The civilization collapsed roughly a century before Columbus. The reasons remain debated, but they cluster around familiar themes.
Climate research points to shifts in rainfall, including periods of drought that would have hurt maize farming.
The overuse of local resources, especially wood, may have made the area harder to live in. Some evidence suggests increasing conflict, with defensive walls, called palisades, being built and rebuilt around the central precinct, hinting at growing insecurity. Social and political stress, perhaps a loss of faith in the rulers who claimed to control the cosmos, may have driven people to simply leave. When Europeans finally arrived in the region centuries later, they found the mounds but no memory of who had built them. This led to one of the more shameful chapters of pseudo-history, as settlers invented fantasies of a vanished race of mound builders, refusing to believe Native Americans could have raised such monuments. The truth is that the descendants of Cahokia were still there, scattered into the many nations of the region. The city had not been built by ghosts. It had been built by ancestors, abandoned not in mystery alone, but in the slow unraveling of a society that grew too large for the land that fed it. Number 4. The Nok culture, Africa's iron pioneers and their vanished art. In the central highlands of Nigeria, farmers and tin miners digging through the soil in the 20th century began turning up something extraordinary.
Fragments of life-size terracotta sculptures, faces and figures sculpted with a confidence and style unlike anything expected from that time and place.
The first famous discovery came in 1928 near a village called Nok, which gave the culture its name. What emerged over the following decades was evidence of one of the most important and least understood civilizations in African history. The Nok culture flourished from around 1500 BC to roughly 300 AD, lasting well over 1,000 years. Its most celebrated legacy is its art. The terracotta sculptures are remarkable, depicting human heads and figures with elaborate hairstyles, jewelry, and strikingly stylized features, often with distinctive triangular or D-shaped eyes. These are among the oldest known figurative sculptures from sub-Saharan Africa, and their sophistication suggests a rich tradition of belief and craftsmanship.
We do not fully know what they were for, though many seem connected to ritual, ancestor veneration, or funerary practice.
But the Nok culture matters for an even bigger reason. It sits at the heart of one of the great questions in African history, the origins of ironworking. The Nok people were smelting iron at a very early date, with some evidence pointing to furnaces operating well over 2,000 years ago, possibly among the earliest in sub-Saharan Africa. This was a profound technological leap. Iron tools transform farming, woodworking, and warfare. The debate among scholars is whether the knowledge of ironworking spread into the region from elsewhere, or whether it was invented independently here in West Africa. If it was independent, it places the Nok among a tiny handful of places on Earth where humanity discovered how to master metal from raw ore on its own. What makes them so frustrating to study is how little they tell us about themselves. They left no writing. Most of the famous sculptures were not found in careful excavations, but dug up by miners and looters, ripped from their original context, which destroyed much of the information archaeologists could have used to understand them. So we have these haunting clay faces staring out across 2,000 years, and almost no story to attach to them. Then, around 300 AD, the Nok culture disappears from the record. The distinctive terracotta tradition ends, and the culture as we recognize it fades. Why? Honestly, we are not sure. There are educated guesses. Intensive ironworking demands enormous amounts of charcoal, which means cutting down vast quantities of trees, so it is possible they exhausted their local forests and degraded the environment that sustained them. Climate change and shifting rainfall may have undermined their farming. Their population may simply have dispersed, blended into, and become ancestral to later peoples and cultures of the region. The likeliest truth is that the Nok did not vanish like a puff of smoke, but transformed, their bloodlines and skills flowing onward into the rich civilizations that would later rise in West Africa. Yet the abruptness of their disappearance from the archaeological record, combined with their silence, leaves a real gap. We are looking at a people who may have helped bring the Iron Age to a continent, who made art of breathtaking beauty, and who slipped away leaving only clay faces and unanswered questions. Number 3. The ancestral Puebloans, the people who walked away from their cliff cities. In the high desert of the American Southwest, in the region where Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico meet, there are cities built into the sky. Tucked into the sheer faces of canyon walls, sheltered beneath overhanging cliffs, stand entire complexes of stone rooms and towers, some with hundreds of chambers, reachable only by climbing. These are the work of the ancestral Puebloans, once commonly called the Anasazi, and they are among the most dramatic ruins on the continent. These people thrived from roughly 900 to 1300 AD, though their roots go back much further. They built in several spectacular ways.
At Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, they raised massive multi-story stone buildings called great houses.
The largest, Pueblo Bonito, contained more than 600 rooms and stood several stories tall, the biggest building in North America until the 19th century. Chaco was a ceremonial and economic hub, connected to outlying communities by an astonishing network of wide, dead-straight roads carved across the desert, running for miles regardless of the terrain. They had a deep knowledge of astronomy, aligning buildings and markers to the movements of the sun and moon, including the complex 18.6-year cycle of the moon. Later, around the 1200s, many of them built the famous cliff dwellings, such as those at Mesa Verde. Sites like Cliff Palace, with around 150 rooms nestled in a great alcove in the rock, were impressive and defensible homes. The shift to these protected, hard-to-reach locations is itself a clue. Why move from open valleys into fortress-like cliffs? It suggests a rising fear of conflict, a need to defend themselves and their stored food from someone. And then, in the late 1200s, they left. Across an entire region, within the span of a generation or two, the ancestral Puebloans abandoned their great houses and cliff cities. They walked away from monumental architecture that had taken centuries to build, leaving pottery,
tools, and homes behind, as if they intended to return.
This sudden, large-scale departure is the great puzzle. The science here is unusually precise, thanks to a remarkable method. The Southwest is dry, so wood survives, and trees in this climate add growth rings that vary with rainfall, wide in wet years, narrow in dry ones. By matching ring patterns from ancient timbers, researchers built a tree ring record stretching back thousands of years, dating buildings to the exact year and reconstructing the ancient climate. That record reveals a catastrophe. A series of severe droughts, including a brutal Great Drought beginning around 1276 and lasting more than 20 years. For a farming people utterly dependent on enough rain to grow maize in a marginal landscape, prolonged drought was a death sentence for the old way of life. But it was probably not drought alone. As crops failed and resources grew scarce, evidence points to rising violence and social conflict, which fits the retreat into defensible cliff homes. Religious and social structures may have broken down as the leaders and beliefs that promised order failed to deliver. The combination of environmental collapse, conflict, and a crisis of faith likely made staying impossible. Crucially, these people did not die out. The term ancestral Puebloans is the key. They migrated south and east to places with more reliable water, where their descendants live to this day as the Hopi, Zuni, and other Pueblo peoples of the Southwest. The cliff cities were not the ruins of an extinct race, but homes that were left behind in a great migration. The mystery is not where the people went, but the wrenching scale of the decision to abandon everything their ancestors had built, driven away by a sky that simply stopped giving rain. Number 2. The Maya. The collapse that happened in plain sight. Deep in the rainforests of Central America, swallowed by jungle and hidden for centuries, stand the remains of one of the most brilliant civilizations the world has ever produced. The Maya built towering pyramids, sprawling cities, and a tradition of learning that rivaled anything in the ancient world. And then,
in one of history's most famous and most misunderstood events, the heart of their civilization collapsed.
the Maya were not a single empire, but a network of independent city-states spread across what is now Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. Their civilization stretched back well over 2,000 years, but the Classic period, from roughly 250 to 900 AD, was their golden age. Cities like Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, and Copan grew into magnificent centers, with temple pyramids rising above the forest canopy, sprawling palaces, ball courts, and plazas crowded with carved monuments. Their intellectual achievements were staggering. The Maya developed the most complete writing system in the pre-Columbian Americas, a complex script of hieroglyphs that after a long struggle, scholars have largely deciphered. This was a breakthrough because it meant the Maya could finally speak to us in their own words, telling us the names of their kings, their wars, their alliances, and their rituals. They were extraordinary astronomers and mathematicians, using the concept of zero centuries before it reached Europe, and tracking the movements of Venus and the cycles of the heavens with remarkable precision. Their calendar was a masterpiece of interlocking cycles, including the long count that famously, and wrongly, fueled modern myths about the end of the world in 2012. Then, beginning around 800 AD and accelerating through the 800s and 900s, the great cities of the southern lowlands fell silent. One by one, the construction of monuments stopped. The dated inscriptions that recorded the deeds of kings simply ended. The cities were abandoned, the populations crashed, and the jungle began to reclaim the pyramids. This is the famous Maya collapse. First, an important correction. The Maya did not vanish, and they did not disappear. This is the biggest myth of all. Millions of Maya people live today across Central America, speaking Mayan languages, keeping ancient traditions alive. What collapsed was a specific political and social system, the world of the divine kings and their grand cities in the southern lowlands. Indeed, in the northern Yucatan, cities like Chichen Itza rose to prominence even as the south declined. So what brought down the southern cities? The evidence increasingly points to a perfect storm. Climate science is again the key witness. Studies of sediment cores and cave formations reveal that the collapse coincided with a series of intense, prolonged droughts striking the region precisely during these centuries. For a dense population relying on rain-fed agriculture and stored water, this was devastating. But the Maya may have made their own situation worse. Their cities had grown enormous, and feeding them required clearing vast tracts of forest for farmland. This deforestation could have worsened soil erosion and may even have intensified the drying of the local climate, a self-inflicted wound layered on top of natural disaster. And then there was war. The deciphered inscriptions reveal that the classic Maya world was riven by intense and escalating warfare between rival city-states, especially the long rivalry between superpowers like Tikal and Calakmul.
As drought squeezed resources and populations strained the land, competition turned vicious.
When the rains failed and the food ran short, the common people may have lost faith in the divine kings, whose whole authority rested on their claimed power to commune with the gods and guarantee the harvest. When the gods seemed to abandon them, so did their people. The Maya collapse, then, is not a single mystery, but a cascade: drought, environmental damage, overpopulation, relentless warfare, and a collapse of faith in the rulers. all feeding into one another. It stands as perhaps the clearest warning from the ancient world. A sophisticated, literate, scientifically advanced civilization brought to its knees by a changing climate and its own choices, leaving its towering monuments to be swallowed by the green. Number 1. The Sea Peoples and the Bronze Age Collapse. The day the ancient world ended. Around 1200 BC, the entire civilized world of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East was thriving. It was a glittering, interconnected age, a true international system. The mighty Egyptian Empire traded and corresponded with the Hittite Empire of Anatolia, the wealthy city-states of Canaan, the merchant kingdoms of Cyprus and Syria, and the warrior palaces of Mycenaean Greece. Diplomats carried letters between kings who called each other brother. Ships laden with copper, tin, gold, and luxury goods crisscrossed the sea. It was a globalized world, complex and rich. Within a span of a few decades, around 1200 to 1150 BC, almost all of it was destroyed. This was not a slow fade like the Maya or the Puebloans. This was a sudden, violent, civilization-ending catastrophe, one of the most dramatic collapses in all of human history. City after city was burned to the ground, many never to be rebuilt. The great Hittite Empire vanished completely, its capital Hattusa abandoned and torched. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece, the world that produced the legends behind Homer, were destroyed, and Greece plunged into a dark age so deep that even the art of writing was lost for centuries. Cities across the Levant and Cyprus fell. Trade collapsed. The interconnected world simply ceased to exist. Egyptian records give us one of the most chilling and famous clues. Pharaoh Ramses III left inscriptions describing a desperate war against a mysterious coalition of invaders he called the Sea Peoples. He wrote that no land could stand before them, that they swept down on the great empires, and that even mighty Hatti, the Hittites, fell before them. He claimed to have defeated them in a great battle, saving Egypt, though Egypt itself was fatally weakened and would never again reach its former glory. For a long time, the Sea Peoples were cast as the villains of the whole story, a horde of mysterious raiders who appeared from nowhere and toppled the empires of the age. But modern scholarship sees them differently. They were probably not the cause of the collapse, but a symptom of it. Themselves refugees and displaced peoples, fleeing a world that was already falling apart, migrating and raiding because their own homes had become unlivable. So what really happened? This is the ultimate version of the pattern we have seen again and again. A systems collapse driven by many forces striking at once.
Climate science reveals a severe, prolonged drought that gripped the Eastern Mediterranean precisely at this time, causing famine. We even have ancient letters desperately begging for grain shipments to stave off starvation. There was a wave of earthquakes, a so-called earthquake storm, that struck the region and damaged many cities. There was widespread warfare, internal rebellions, and the migrations of peoples like the Sea Peoples. But perhaps the deepest cause was the very interconnectedness that made the age so glittering. These civilizations were specialized and dependent on one another and on long-distance trade. Bronze itself, the metal that named the age, required copper and tin often came from far away. When the trade networks were disrupted by drought, famine, and raiding, the whole tightly woven system began to unravel. Each collapse triggered the next. As one kingdom fell, the refugees, the broken trade, and the chaos spread to its neighbors, like a row of dominoes toppling across the ancient world. The result was a dark age that lasted for centuries. When civilization eventually re-emerged, the world had changed. The old empires were gone, new peoples and powers had risen, iron had begun to replace bronze, and new alphabets would soon spread. The Bronze Age collapse stands as the most haunting story of all, because it was not the death of one city or one people, but the death of an entire interconnected world, brought down in a single lifetime by the combined weight of climate change, natural disaster, war, and the fragility of a system that had grown too connected to survive the shock. And that is perhaps the most important lesson these vanished worlds leave us. Civilizations rarely fall for a single, simple reason. They fall when many pressures strike at once, when the climate turns, when resources run short, when faith in the old order breaks, and when systems that seem strong reveal themselves to be fragile. The people did not always disappear, but their worlds did, leaving behind silent ruins and warnings we would be wise to remember.